Hello, I'm Mark Licht. I'm an Extension Cropping Systems Specialist with the Department of Agronomy at Iowa State University.
Hi, I'm Adam Janke. I'm the Wildlife Extension Specialist in the Department of Natural Resource Ecology and Management at Iowa State. And we're out here at the Field Extension Education Laboratory. And Mark, what does that mean? What do we use this facility for?
Yeah, so this facility is really an extension teaching facility. So we bring in a lot of farmers and a lot of agronomists to talk about different things within crop production. And so today we're actually standing in a perennial seeding. It's actually a CP23 mix that we're standing in that was established in the spring of 2020. We chose this area largely because this part of the farm typically has water ponding in it, especially in the spring of the year when the creek bank over there comes out of its banks and comes up here and ponds for several weeks at a time. And so this area we generally did not get good crop growth and productivity out of, and so it was a prime candidate to put into perennial grasses.
So that's what brings me here. I'm a wildlife ecologist and normally do my education on the margins of our crop fields. And instead, we're here in what used to be a plot, a demonstration plot that kind of consistently caused problems or challenges at the farm in the production goals and wasn't actually achieving the educational goal set out for demonstrating soybean production practices or varieties and things like that. And instead, we rethought what we wanted to do with this piece of the farm in a way that we find farmers across Iowa are starting to rethink about where the field margins should be and what some alternatives could be in areas that are consistently not producing or not profitable, in an opportunity to integrate wildlife habitat, diverse native perennial vegetation back into our landscape that provides water quality benefits, soil health benefits, wildlife and biodiversity benefits, beautiful aesthetics, and it takes an area that we used to be losing money and makes it at least cost neutral, and in some cases maybe a little bit profitable if we can enroll it in something like this conservation reserve program.
So when we look at this area, it looks really good now, a year and a half later. But what we did to establish this area is it was soybeans the prior year to establishment. We came in the spring of the year and we broadcast seeded at a frost seeding time frame, and then we let it get up and going, and we mowed it off 3 times through that growing season. And then earlier this year, in the June time frame, we mowed it off once, for that. And so that was the practice that we used to get this established, and we have pretty good establishment out here, I think.
So one important consideration that we need to remember when we're growing native perennial plants on our farm is that the management of those plants is going to be different than what we're used to in our typical crop production practices. And that's because in our typical crop production practices, we're growing annual plants. And in native planting like this, we're growing perennial plants that'll be here for a long time. And the biggest distinction with a perennial plant is that in the first year or year and a half, those perennial plants are growing down instead of putting biomass above ground like we're used to seeing with our crops or our annual plants. And so that's why we need to take care in the first year or 2 years to really try to create conditions that are favorable for the establishment of those root systems that'll feed that perennial plant for years to come and to help it outcompete all the annual plants that are going to be found on the site as well. We've actually found that the people out here at Field have done a really nice job in stewarding this planting to ensure that the perennial plants were favored over the annuals. And here, 2 years almost after the first seeding, we find that that's paid off with the growth of some really nice native grasses and native wildflowers that are going to take off from here and start to dominate even more now that they have these well-established root systems.
So that establishment's really quite key, Adam. So we look at even this, and yes, there's a lot of the desirable species out here that we want to see. There's the native grasses, there's some of the forbs out here, but you still see some of the annual grasses, the annual weeds out here. And we're 2 years into it,
Yeah.
but it's something that we should expect. And quite honestly, a lot of people get really frustrated in that first year because they hardly see any of the natives and they see mostly the annual weedy species.
Yes, so a perennial planting like this takes time, and it takes patience, and it takes persistence. And what we want to talk about today is some of the practices that you could employ on your farm if you're thinking about finding these low profit areas to put into perennial vegetation to ensure the most likely successful outcome on your farm. Okay, so in the introduction to the video, you told us about some of the steps that you and the folks at Field took to get us here. So let's walk us through. One thing you said was CP23 mix. What does that mean, and why is it that you chose that for this site?
Yeah, so a CP23 mix it's a conservation program mixture, and it's designed for these lower, wetter areas that tend to be saturated for a good portion of the time. A CP23 mix is more heavily on the grasses and less heavy on the forbs, and so it's one of those that, yes, you're going to get some pollinator, you're going to get some migratory species that are going to come through it, but we're really targeting, the grasses here more so than other species.
I love it when an agronomist talks about pollinators and migratory species. So I agree. And yes, so the nice thing about CP23 is it's a widespread conservation reserve program practice. And so it's basically a seed mix that you can buy off the shelf. Mm-hmm. You could go it alone. There's lots of resources from, for example, the Tallgrass Prairie Center at the University of Northern Iowa that could help you devise your own seed mix. But for the most part, a turnkey operation of a nice mix of native perennial plants that are adapted to wet spots is going to be something that's going to work in floodplains and prairie potholes and other places that we find where crops consistently fail across the state. Mm-hmm. So we picked our seed mix. We did our first year control in that we're thinking about any potential residual herbicide effects, particularly probably following corn as the most consequential. We have good weed control. And then now we need to plant it. What we say about planting native perennial vegetation is that we often want to do it the way Mother Nature would do it. And the way Mother Nature does it is she spreads the seed on the surface of the ground over winter after all these plants have matured, developed that seed, and then just dropped it. So this isn't something that we need to bury deep into the ground like sometimes we're tempted to do in our gardens or in our fields. We want to put this, just scratch it into the surface if you use a no-till drill, or you could even do a broadcast seeding like what we did in this patch here.
So keep in mind that a lot of these species, the seeds are very small. And so like any small seeded species, the depth is really key. And so right on the soil surface with some rain is enough soil to seed contact to actually get good germination and emergence. You think of corn, soybeans, or even some of the small grains, they're much larger seeds, and so putting them, a 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch to 2 inches deep works best. But with these species, if you get it too deep, you're going to actually really hurt your establishment.
Yep.
So Adam, after we get it established and we get going, how do we manage it from there? Kind of nurture that establishment a little bit further.
So it's going to be different every year that the plot is out there. This is a long-term investment. It isn't necessarily something that we plant and we leave it. And that's especially true in the first 2 years. And that's where, as we mentioned, out here, there was consistent mowing. And we want to try to, whenever we have an opportunity, scout our fields and understand the competition between the native perennial plants that are growing down in that first year. We want to try to find those and understand how they're relating to all the annual plants, the weeds essentially, that are trying to grow up and take advantage of all the sunlight. And we can advantage those native perennial plants in the first year by relatively consistent mowing, something like 3 mowings throughout the growing season at 6 to 8 inches. It doesn't need to look like a golf course. It shouldn't look like a golf course, but something that sort of sets back those annuals and gives those perennials that are just right at the surface of the ground a chance to gather some sunlight and invest in those roots in that first year. The second year of the planting, we start to think about our transition out of the mowing phase, and we can base it off of scouting. We can look at whether or not the perennials have established in the plot and how the annuals are doing as well. And we may be able to let it go, or as we mentioned in this plot, we did mow it once earlier this year to allow for some of these warm season species to come on later in the year and start to outcompete the annuals. And then from there, your plot should theoretically be established. We want to keep scouting it and looking for problematic species like invasive species like Canada thistle or other problematic species that might threaten the stand. And then we also want to anticipate sort of a long-term management strategy. And the best long-term management strategy, if we can do it, is prescribed fire.
Sure.
To occasionally burn off some of the plant residual, favor the growth of many of these wildflowers and wild grass, native grasses that are adapted to fire, and also to outcompete the encroachment of woody vegetation that even in this 1.5-year-old plot, we already see some woody vegetation establishing, and we'll want to try to find a way to manage that. Fire is a really good way to do that too.
And for that intermediate to long-term management, yes, the fires are great, but things like the Canada thistle or some of the other weedy species, you may end up going in and just spot spraying an individual area or timing a mowing, just for an isolated area a little bit there too. So it's kind of a mix and match depending on what you're seeing as you're walking out through those areas.
Yep. So once we've established our diverse native perennials on a wet spot or unprofitable area on the farm, what sort of benefits can we expect to see? That's certainly something that, again, as a wildlife ecologist that works on the edges of our crop production practices, I get really excited about. We can find lots of different species of wildlife that take advantage of this diverse native perennial vegetation, even in really small patches like this. So we know monarch butterflies, for example, will certainly take advantage of small patches of flowering plants, and even better if we have milkweeds growing in them. And then we also find a bunch of different species of farmland birds will take advantage of areas like this. We could commonly expect to see things like eastern or western meadowlarks, dick thistles, song sparrows, common yellowthroats, and other species of birds would be pretty common to find in these areas in our farms where they wouldn't have been there when it was just a failed crop field. The other benefits is if you enjoy birds like I do and like many of our farmer partners and friends do, or if you enjoy wildflowers or just the blowing of native grasses on the breeze, the aesthetics of places like this are really quite remarkable. And we hope that that's something that people can see the value in, find value for them and their family to visit these areas throughout the year and see the different species of flowers in bloom or the different species of butterflies or birds taking advantage of them, and kind of just provide an enriching experience on the farm that's a little less tangible, but certainly something that we understand many people are motivated by.
Another environmental aspect of it is just the change in water quality. And so obviously the footprint of these, we have water quality benefits just because we're not putting in the fertilizers and the chemicals. And so we have that soil health, I'll say, benefit with the footprint, right? But then as we think about on the landscape, where we're at right now, we're at the bottom of a slope. So we're on the toe slope or on the edge of the depressional area. But we have water moving down this slope, and so these areas are going to serve as kind of a filter. So we're going to reduce some of that soil nitrate that's moving through the soil here as well. And so it's going to prevent it from going right down into that creek right over there. And so that's another benefit for us when we think of this overall. And then lastly, and Adam mentioned this in our introduction a little bit, one of the reasons that this really is enticing is because it can increase our field profitability overall, right? So if these areas aren't producing and then we're not getting any revenue off of them, yet we put the cost of production into it, we're lowering our field profitability. Yes, you have some one-time costs and some establishment costs associated with these areas, but after that, you don't have the kind of the cost per acre, cost of production going into these, and therefore we're able to raise that profitability over the long term. And so there's a big benefit there as well.
So Mark, you brought up the idea of costs or the challenge of or opportunities of costs, and we should be mindful that there are expenses related to the implementation of a conservation practice like this. And so we want to sort of account for some of those. The inputs are time, equipment, and seed. And the seed costs can be pretty variable depending on what you want to plant and what's available at a given time. But we find these seed costs range from $100 to $300 an acre with sort of a Cadillac, Forb, or diversity-rich planting on the higher end of that, and more sort of homogeneous grass stand with just a few forbs on the lower end of that. The other costs, of course, would just be the equipment and time that you invest in it, particularly in those first couple of years. It's important to know that in some cases there's funding available to help implement this conservation practice on your farm. One, it may be compelling and an opportunity to enroll in a conservation reserve program practice. And we do have some conservation reserve program practices that could be tailored to fit this sort of an implementation on your farm. The prairie strips practice, CP43, also the farmable wetlands one would just be two examples, and there could be some more creative thinking as well. Other funding opportunities, maybe not necessarily a land rental rate like the Conservation Reserve Program offers, but there's lots of funding out there available to help purchase seed or defray the cost of seed. And two examples that come to mind, one is a state program called the Prairie Partners Program, where the Iowa Department of Natural Resources will help farmers cost share the cost of seed to plant native perennial vegetation on their farms. And another one that may work is the Environmental Quality Incentives Program through the NRCS that also has funding available for the establishment of diverse native perennial vegetation on farms, and this could certainly qualify for that as well.
So the key with these cost share opportunities, one, get into your district conservation office because they're going to know a lot of the government programs. And sometimes they even, like the DNR wildlife biologists, are embedded within those. And so they would also be able to help you get connected with the various opportunities for some funding.
And importantly, those people have a lot of experience in the science of establishing diverse native perennial vegetation on the farm. And as we mentioned, this is a little bit different, and many farmers are really good at producing their primary crops, but this is a different crop and this is a different paradigm, and we often have a lot of learning to do. And those professionals that you mentioned through NRCS, soil water conservation districts, the Iowa Department of Natural Resources, or nonprofit groups like Pheasants Forever can be really important critical resources to help us ensure a successful experience on our farm, and maybe lead to the next one and the next one to really get this practice sort of adopted on the wide scale.